Hi there, and welcome once again to Friday Focus, where we do not focus on what is seen, but on what is unseen. We're continuing our look at the Psalms. Today we're dealing with Psalm 22 on Friday Focus. Psalm 22, I call it Crisis Response. Have you ever been in a completely overwhelming situation where you could see no way out? And by all accounts, it should have been your end? I have. It was a plane crash in Mexico. The Bible relates one such situation that happened to Peter. The scripture goes on to say that about this time or that time, King Herod Agrippa began to persecute some believers in the church. He had the apostle James, John's brother, killed with a sword. When Herod saw how much this pleased the Jewish people, he also arrested Peter. This took place during the Passover celebration. Then he imprisoned him, placing him under the guard of 4 squads of 4 soldiers. So 16 soldiers were guarding Peter. Herod intended to bring Peter out for public trial after the Passover. You find that in Acts chapter 12, verses 1 through 4. There was no doubt Peter's life was in jeopardy. However, the church earnestly prayed, and an angel freed Peter. It was a situation where, if God hadn't intervened, Peter would have been a dead man. According to Psalm 22, David's predicament was equally perilous. It was so bad at one point that he felt even God had deserted him. Look at David's anguished cry. He says, my God, why have you abandoned me? Why are you so far away when I groan for help? Every day I call to you, my God, but you do not answer. Every night you hear my voice, but I find no relief. Psalm 22, verses 1 and 2. Imagine how David must have felt. Are you in a similar place? It obviously was an extremely painful and bitter place for David. Here's what he writes about it. My life is poured out like water. All my bones are out of joint. My heart is like wax melting within me. My strength is dried up like sun-baked clay. My tongue sticks to the roof of my mouth. You've laid me in the dust and left me for dead. My enemies surround me like a pack of dogs. An evil gang closes in on me. They've pierced my hands and feet. I can count all my bones. Verses 14 through 17a of Psalm 22. Now, these aren't the words of someone who is merely depressed. They're words that come from life at its lowest, when one is exhausted mentally, emotionally, physically, and spiritually. If some of those words seem familiar to you, by the way, it's because this is a messianic psalm. 1,000 years after David, Jesus quoted from Psalm 22 while hanging on the cross. What depth of agony would give rise to words like that? Verses 14 through 18 were fulfilled during the crucifixion. This is what the Son of Righteousness, Jesus Christ, endured, weighted down with our sin. But as we look at Psalm 22 for us, there are 4 things that we can learn. Number 1, be honest with God about feelings. It's interesting to note that although David's opening words make it appear that his relationship with his God is severed, that isn't the case. Notice the first 4 words of the psalm, my God, my God. Despite his crushing status, David still refers to the Lord as my God. Twice he says it, my God, my God. In that single possessive pronoun, he acknowledges both his faith and his dependence on the Lord. It's okay to tell God what you're feeling and how you're feeling. We're often told to give God our hurts and our woes. It's perfectly fine to give him your feelings too, even if he seems distant and silent. The second thing we learn is to acknowledge God despite feelings. Yeah, you may feel down in the dumps. You might feel at the bottom. But we need to still acknowledge God. Although David is in the middle of a crushing experience that seemingly has anesthetized him to God's presence, he stands on what he knows to be true, not on what he feels. He says in verse 3, "Yet you are holy, enthroned on the praises of Israel." With these words, David elevates truth over feelings. He acknowledges God's existence, his holiness, his sovereignty. He refuses to allow his feelings to call the shots. Are you allowing your feelings to call the shots these days? I'm sure you will agree that we all have had those times when we have allowed our feelings to dictate our response with regretful results. Don't do it. And then number 3, we need to acknowledge God's faithfulness. Yes, even in the middle of our trial, when it doesn't seem like he's around, by faith we acknowledge his faithfulness. The next thing David does as he continues his psalm is to remind himself of God's faithfulness to his people. This is what he says: "Our ancestors trusted in you, and you rescued them. They cried out to you and were saved. They trusted in you and were never disgraced," verses 4 and 5. Now, I don't want to minimize feelings, but they should never precede facts. As David looked at the history of God's people, everything in him had to admit the fact that despite what he was going through, God had been faithful. Do you ever look back on your life and take inventory of God's faithfulness to you? It's a good thing to do at any time, whether in crisis or time of blessing. The fourth thing that we learn is we need to allow God's faithfulness to speak to us. Yeah, allow God's faithfulness to speak to you. Take time to recount God's faithfulness and allow the facts to dictate your feelings. Why do I say this? I say it because there's nothing quite like recounting God's faithfulness and blessings to dispel feelings of despair and to build faith. As you read the ending of Psalm 22, you can easily spot the transformation that has taken place. He says in verse 25, "I will praise you in the great assembly. I will fulfill my vows in the presence of those who worship you." David has moved from cries of anguish and despair to words of praise and faith. Notice his concluding statements. He says, "For royal power belongs to the Lord. He rules all the nations. Let the rich of the earth feast and worship. Bow before him, all who are mortal, all whose lives will end as dust. Our children will also serve him. Future generations will hear about the wonders of the Lord. His righteous acts will be told to those not yet born." Hey, that's you and me. "They will hear about everything he has done," verses 28 through 31. So, no matter your feelings, the facts are God is still on the throne. He still loves you, and he's still faithful. This is Dr. Vic Hollyfriend in his grace. If you have any comments or questions, you may address them to me at Vic's Friday Focus. That's all one word, Vic's Friday Focus at gmail.com. That's Vic's Friday Focus at gmail.com. God bless you. Have a tremendous week.